Hello everybody and welcome to the, I don't know what edition of the privacy platform, but we've had a long tradition of organizing a session during the CPDP conference, so I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to start with an apology because due to unforeseen circumstances I will have to leave you at 1:30. But the good news is that I will then be giving over the chair to my colleague Moritz Körner, who's my new colleague in the Renew group from Germany, and he's a real privacy and data protection champion. I mean, so far I've been, a kitty cat. He's a real tiger when it comes to privacy. So this is the man to talk to in the years to come. So you'll be in very good hands. And I'm not going to take up much of your time for speaking some introductory words, and then I'll introduce the panel. The title of today's platform is Facial Recognition, a convenient and efficient solution looking for a problem. Now, facial recognition is one of the domineering topics of this conference. I have seen it has risen on the agenda very, very rapidly. And I was just thinking, every time you think that I remember when nobody was talking about privacy, or only a few lost souls who are probably also in this room. And then all of a sudden everybody was talking about privacy and data protection, and it wasn't considered such a hot topic anymore. And now all of a sudden we found something new, which is a hot topic. And I think that becomes clear not just from the program and the many sessions dedicated to the topic, but also the fact that even the European Commission, who is sometimes, but not always, privacy's best friend, even the European Commission is now considering at least a temporary ban on facial recognition until we have a better idea of what it can and cannot do, and how we're going to protect people's rights. In the meantime, just to show how rapidly things are evolving, since we selected the title and the topic for this session, news broke, or rather the New York Times reported very extensively about a company called Clearview, which offers an app that uses facial recognition to search a database of, I believe, 3 billion images or something like that. Sounds like a lot. In any case, what's worrying is not that people are developing such apps, because they're trying to do that the whole time. What's worrying is that by now 600 police forces around the world are using that app. And we have just this morning, our group has submitted questions to the European Commission, but also to the European Data Protection Board, because I think it is urgent that we get clarification. Are European police forces using this, but also what are the rules that apply? And we're also asking the Data Protection Board to provide some guidance. So we've really tried to put this on the agenda. Okay, I'm not going to say much more about this. I'm going to introduce the panel. I don't know if you yourselves have a preferred order for speaking, but I'll just introduce you from right to left. Mrs. Cornelia Kutterer to my right, well known to you, previously Buke, and now on the other side, you might say. To my left, Mrs. Lotte Houwing from Bits of Freedom, and to her left, Mr. Legrand from CNIL from France. So maybe I'm going to invite you to speak in that order, and I'm going to ask you to speak for, let's say, 7-8 minutes max, and then I'll pass over. And again, at 1:30, I'll just sneak out without interrupting, saying anything, and then Moritz here will be in charge. Mrs. Kutterer, you have the floor.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And I don't necessarily feel this is moving from one side to the other. Because this is another debate. So thanks for having me here. I will try to do this very, very quickly. We have, as Microsoft, started to raise this issue around July 2018. I've been very happy to take this on in Europe as a topic to say, well, facial recognition technology amongst AI more generally, where we currently look all at how we develop frameworks around it, has a specific sensitive issue because it can be used for mass surveillance. Hence, we urge governments around the globe to legislate specifically. And from July 2018 until around July 2019, we have been raising awareness, we've been organizing workshops, speaking on panels, and there was sort of like it's amazing, we're calling for regulation, we get fairly lukewarm responses from regulators in Europe. There was an inflection point, summer 2019, because suddenly there was DPA decisions that started to occur. There was a very interesting court decision, the first one, and to my knowledge, the only one currently in Europe, that it investigated in depth into the use of facial recognition, and in particular, most importantly, the rollout across Europe of facial recognition technology has really taken up, and I think this mix of issues became now really more topical. We have developed principles and have tried to specify these principles in what we think how this should be regulated. And of course, in Europe, we are in a very different situation as we are in the United States. We have not only GDPR, we also do have a fundamental rights framework and a human rights framework that is applicable. And I would urge everybody that hasn't done so yet to actually go and read the South Wales decision in detail, because it very clearly identifies that the privacy in public is infringed upon when using facial recognition, but it's not the core of the right, so it can be justified when the use of the technology is proportionate and necessary. And here we go into the details what that actually means. In my mind, and there's certainly different legal opinions around this, largely when you think about the Human Rights Convention and the Fundamental Rights Charter, it gives governments an obligation to legislate around these situations to make it specific. It's also interesting to note that in a number of member states, when I'm focusing a little bit in on the police use of it, that it's actually currently not legal, so there is no legal base for police to use it, so they are currently legislating. Germany is one of the countries where this is currently happening, and in Belgium, I think the police is looking at it without legislation. One important part is when you develop facial recognition technology, there is this bigger question in whether GDPR actually, at what point GDPR actually applies. It might not when you use data sets that are not relevant in this context. And so there is basically the deployers that are the controllers that have to comply with either the police directive or GDPR. And that's where we say, well, there is also an issue around not only privacy, but also quality. And we should start looking at AI, in particular facial recognition technology, more in this context of quality of service. So what we have been advocating for is that the developers should actually be obliged to make their facial recognition technology available for testing. They should document limitations and capabilities of the facial recognition technology and be thereby transparent, so that the deployers of facial recognition technologies can actually choose the right technology for their specific purposes. We have, for example, developed and published a transparency report to give deployers of the technology the guidance they need to deploy it in a fair and human rights respective manner. It's interesting that this was also these calls for regulating the the developers of facial recognition technologies, so the issues that we specifically demand for us. We have as principles We believe that this is a bottom line that cannot rely only on ethical companies, but should be rule or codes of conducts and something in between. So that's really why we are calling for it. So these parts of what we call for, which we believe is not, or only in a very complicated way, part of GDPR, have also been considered in the South Wales discussion, and were parts of why the court came to the conclusion that in that specific case, the use of facial recognition technology was necessary and proportionate. Now, it's of course interesting that this court case is now in appeal, and I think this is probably a good thing because it will further clarify where those limitations then actually are in our society. So, and with that, I would stop.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I will immediately give the floor to Lotte.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy that it enables us to share our thoughts with you today. The title of this panel discussion, as you all could see, is Facial Recognition, a convenient and efficient solution looking for a problem. I think this question is a good representation of the way technology finds its way into society more often. It represents a perspective that takes the technology as a starting point, trying to find a possible match with our society. It basically asks the question, how and where can we use this technology? Sometimes a bit of ethics or human rights is thrown into the mix, and it brings up questions like, under what circumstances or under what conditions are we allowed to use this technology? Or what safeguards should apply? But if we take one step back, we can ask the question, whose convenience and whose efficiency we're talking about. Regarding facial recognition surveillance technology in public space, two main parties will benefit from a slow and steady introduction of the technology. These are governments hungry for control and industry seeking product market fits. Governments are likely to face less resistance when far-reaching surveillance technologies are introduced slowly, because of normalization of the technology and citizens getting fatigued and wary after being mobilized by civil society for every expansion of the development. Corporate calls for ethics committees serve to aid function creep, supporting a slow and steady expansion of the technology. When over time the implementation of the surveillance technology is normalized, the use can be expanded, leading to a new demand for it. We believe this perspective distracts from a more fundamental discussion, skipping the question whether we should want facial recognition surveillance in public space at all, and leaving us with insufficient protection of our fundamental rights and free societies. When we take a fundamental rights perspective, a totally different set of questions will have to be discussed. First, as the EDPS wrote in his blog, any infringement on our fundamental rights must be demonstrably necessary. And in this regard, convenience and efficiency do not amount to necessity. Here we should be very critical, because it will not be the first time surveillance measures being introduced with a poorly motivated necessity. So is there any evidence that we need this technology at all? Are there really no alternatives that make less infringements on our rights and freedoms and have less consequences for our society? Secondly, deployment of facial recognition surveillance will need a valid legal basis, but it is incompatible with our data protection framework. The GDPR, as well as the Law Enforcement Directive, both forbid the processing of biometric data. It would not be a legal instrument if there were no exceptions, but then the processing should still be strictly necessary, proportionate, respecting the essence of the right to data protection, and provide for suitable specific measures to safeguard the fundamental rights and interests of the data subject. Is it even possible? We don't think so, since facial recognition surveillance in public space inherently requires mass-scale processing of biometric data. Thirdly, the effects of technology as a means of surveillance in public space will always be untargeted. Facial recognition surveillance in public space cannot be used as a target capability. The faces of everybody passing the camera system will be scanned and analyzed, possible even without people knowing about it. This means our ability to move through public space anonymously is at stake. Do we think it is acceptable to be reduced to walking barcodes? Then there is the issue of location of the actual physical space where the technology will be deployed. Human rights should be the same for everyone. If we want people to feel safe and not to be discriminated based on their sexual preferences, there is no space for facial recognition technology near gay saunas and bars. If we want people to be free and safe to practice their religion of choice, there is no space for facial recognition technology near mosques, synagogues, or churches. If we want people to engage in the public debate, there is no space for facial recognition technology on our streets. This raises the question, in a free and democratic society, is there space for facial recognition surveillance at all? And last but not least, the effect of facial recognition surveillance is and will be discriminatory, especially in the surveillance context where the imagery is recorded in uncontrolled circumstances. Facial recognition has an accuracy problem. This problem follows the lines of gender as well as the color of our skin and will reinforce and exacerbate systemic inequality. It is yet unknown whether it is possible to debias this technology. It might also not solve the problem, since technology that works equally well on everybody might not work equally well for everybody. What we do know are examples of unethical data collection to still the hunger of machine learning algorithms in an attempt to wash the technology of racial bias. However, we should not forget that fixing the technological deficiencies will not fix the problem, since application of facial recognition surveillance in public space is an even bigger threat to our human rights when it works. To come to my conclusion, if we agree that we should prioritize our rights and freedoms in an open and free society, then facial recognition surveillance is not a solution looking for a problem. It is a problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Legrand.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. Well, facial recognition is an extremely important topic because it has the potential to be a game changer for our societies. I think this has been explained before. It's the reason why. Yes, sorry. It's the reason why in 2018, the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, called for a broad debate on smart video-assisted technologies such as mobile cameras, automated analysis of videos, and of course facial recognition. So the debate is taking up, and we're very pleased that we're having this conversation today because it's really a crucial matter, and it's a matter of societal changes. Before I go deeper in the technology itself, let me just say it's not a debate of those that are pro-technology versus those that are against the technology. It's not a debate of modern people against old-fashioned people. As was said before, GDPR recognized in 2018, this was the choice of the European legislator, to state that biometric data were sensitive data with an additional layer of protection. If you look outside of the EU, regions of the world which are pioneers in technology, like California, are also thinking about bans for certain uses of facial recognition. So let's not, oversimplify the debate and say it's those that don't want the technology versus the ones that want the technology. It's essential to be proactive. It's essential to be forward-looking. So that we avoid any unwanted change of our society and wake up one day and say things have changed and we can't do anything about it anymore. So this is why I'm very pleased also to be sitting on a panel with people from the European Parliament, because I think we must make a political conscious choice to preserve what we call in France our Republican Pact on Digital Technology, which is enshrined in GDPR. So we must decide what can be done in our democratic societies before we talk about acceptability. We must decide what is acceptable, what is needed, and then think about how we do it. If you go deeper in the technology, it's also important to think that there's not one facial recognition, one use of facial recognition. There's very different uses that come with different risks. From the technology perspective, you can have authentication or identification. So I'll try to make it very simple. Authentication, I claim an identity, which is, for instance, on the card that I hold. and the system will scan my face and check that my face matches the biometric data that is on my card. This can be done locally without any central database, with limited impact on privacy. If you speak about identification, the most extensive case is the one that was described just before, where you scan everybody in the public space and you try to put dynamically a name on everybody that is passing on the public space. So you scan a face and you try to identify against all the people that are already known by the system. And of course, it's not the same problem in terms of complexity, and it's not the same problems in terms of risk to people. There's many possible uses. I can unlock my smartphone and do this locally. I can go to the airport and go through the automated border control that will check what is on my passport and check if my face is the one that is on my passport. I can have digital identities, which are created with biometrics. In France, we had a project called Alice M, which basically is including your passport in your phone as a digital identity, and to prove that I'm the one holding the passport, I will do a facial recognition verification. You can have systems. We've had projects in France to put facial recognitions in high schools to facilitate the access control in high schools. The CNIL, I'll make a small teaser, CNIL said no to this, said it was not GDPR compliant. And of course, there's people thinking about recognizing everybody on the fly in public spaces. So it's really essential to think on a case-by-case basis and avoid any confusion. The risks really depend on the use cases. Data can be collected at a distance in public spaces without even the user being aware of it. So if I'm walking in the streets and the camera is 50 meters away and captures my face, it's not the same problem. The person is not aware in the same way as if you go through the gateway for automatic border control at the airport, where you have a choice. You can either go to see the police border control or go through the automated gateway. You consent to go through this system. You know exactly what is going on, and this is done locally. Okay, so the risks are clearly not the same in those two use cases. Another important thing to keep in mind is that biometrics are not perfect. So we talked about biases, but if you think about the way it works, my system is my face is in the system, so there's a biometric template for my face. Then when I'm being recognized by the camera, what the system will do, it will calculate my biometric template again, and it will try to match the two. Above a certain threshold of similarity, the system will say, you're that person that was already known. Okay? If I'm below that threshold, then the system will say, no, you're not that person. So it carries some mistakes. It's normal. There's a threshold, and you decide on the threshold, and this is what we call the false acceptance rate and the false rejection rate, which has impacts either in terms of discrimination. If you have a false rejection because you're not being recognized by the system, I'm supposed to enter a building, for instance, and the system tells me I'm not recognized, I'm not allowed to go in. And it can have impact in terms of public security if you use this for access control for public security purposes, to protect an event, for instance, and a bad person is coming in. So this has to be kept in mind. Another thing is that, and this has been said already by Lotte, there's this increased surveillance which is enabled by the technology that may reduce the level of anonymity that you have in the public space today. So the way we interact with our environment. And technically speaking, of course, I've said this before, if the data is processed locally, stays under your control. This is something which is true for many types of personal data processing. In general, it tends to be more privacy friendly than if you send everything in a database. You lose the control of your data and you don't know how it's going to be processed. So please, let's not talk about facial recognition in general. Let's talk about use cases and think which use cases are more risky, which use cases are less risky, and which use cases perhaps should be forbidden. This is super important. An assessment on a case-by-case basis to determine what risks are not acceptable in a democratic society and which ones can be assumed with appropriate safeguards. There's a legal framework in Europe. It has been modernized. We have the GDPR, we have the Police Justice Directive, In France, I will speak for France, we have things also in the French law. To make a long story short, either you have consent when you use facial recognition and biometrics. Consent means an alternative. You have a choice. You can go in the facial recognition system, or you can do something else for the same objective. And if it's generalized in the public space for public security purposes, the law in France is you need either a law or a decree. So you can't just deploy the system and say everything is fine. You need to have a political decision saying to say in which conditions this is made possible. And this is true even for experiments. So people who are talking about experimenting facial recognition need to comply with the existing legal framework, which makes it possible to process facial recognition data, but which has put a number of safeguards in our legal systems. Certain systems are possible. I can give you examples. They're possible in principle, and they're regulated by regulators such as data protection authorities. We had the border control at the airport, which I listed before. We had a trial in Nice for the carnival at the beginning of last year. It's a trial to test the technology. Other uses were refused. I've talked about it briefly before, like access control in high schools to have a system that is more fluid. It was disproportionate because it was biometric data on vulnerable people for a purpose that could be achieved with something that was less invasive. So it's possible, but we already have some safeguards, and experiments need to follow the legal framework. Last point, briefly, what is the role of a regulator like CNIL? CNIL is the Data Protection Authority. We have several missions. In our missions, we can, of course, help give some advice on how to apply the legal framework, but we're not a decision maker, and we're not a prescriber in terms of legislation. This is the role of the Parliament. The choice of the framework, its nature, its scope, rests with the government and with the Parliament. We give some advice. We can give some advice to the public sector when they want to deploy some systems in line with the existing legal framework, by providing independent advice, by contributing within our sphere of competence to the assessment of the devices. And of course, we can inspect and we can ask for corrective measures if necessary to protect the people. This is our role, and this is what we plan to do in the context of the debate in an independent manner. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for all our panelists here for their introductory remarks. So Sophie now had to run back to the Parliament, but she just gave me, her thought was golden times coming up for plastic surgeons now with all this facial recognition everywhere. Maybe before I pass it on to you and to your questions, Sophie already mentioned that in her opening remarks. There was this leak that the European Commission is thinking about banning facial recognition in public spaces for 5 years, maybe. Maybe very short from all of the every panelist here. What do you think about that? Would that be a right take on to wait to ban it until we know more about the technology, especially in public spaces? So you started, then.
Yeah. So we all have. Most of us probably have seen and read the white paper now, which was broadly leaked. Yeah. This is option 2, as specifically regulating facial recognition with as ultima ratio a ban to understand better or regulate better. The Commission in that leaked paper, and we have no idea how far their current thinking is, also said that they would prefer option 3 to option 5, excluding basically that option. As I mentioned, in public spaces, precisely because of GDPR, commercial use of facial recognition technology seems largely unfeasible, unwanted. and there would be only a solution based on another legal basis, in particular for law enforcement. And as I mentioned, in a number of countries at least, there is currently no legal basis. So there is, in principle, already an existing de facto ban. And it's going to be more interesting for the Commission to think about whether they, and this is a legal dispute, whether they at a European level would be actually have the competence across Europe to define what those boundaries are. So we have GDPR and we have the police directive for data protection. But in this specific case, according at least to this one court case, you have to be much more specific, and the safeguards need to be much clearer defined. Again, for example, in that case, one of the things the police did was they had a human review of the positives. There was a deletion directly after those for the false negatives, and so those parameters in principle could be already enshrined in law, so that citizens don't have to go to court if the police thinks otherwise. So it would be an interesting avenue to say this is exactly how it's going to be. I think that would be the better way forward.
Maybe some short opinions from you, and then we pass to the floor.
Well, regarding the use of facial recognition in public space as a surveillance tool, I would say we have an existing legal framework. We have international human rights. We have the GDPR. I don't believe this framework leaves space for such a use case. So I would say it is already illegal according to our existing laws. Therefore, we do not have any need, I would say, for a new one stating things that are already there. However, since we have this discussion, and also if you look at the practice in some countries, if I may believe so, we might need some clarification from parliaments that explain these laws to at least make these protections also into practice.
Yeah, very briefly, the CNIL published a paper on facial recognition in November 2018. It's on the website, it's in French and in English. It explains that there is a legal framework, that the legal framework has to be respected even for experiments, and that currently under the current legal frameworks, some uses of facial recognition, at least, well, it depends always on a case-by-case basis, but I'll take the example of these high schools, the access control in the high schools. The way it was presented, this specific project had to be refused because it did not meet the bar that was in GDPR. So we have this already. What is important to keep in mind is perhaps some people want to do experiments. If they do experiments, not all use cases carry the same risks. And politicians clearly need to think about what is possible and what should be forbidden in our democratic societies. And then you can think about the safeguards. You can think about some technical protections in the implementation of biometrics. You can think about some procedural obligations if you're implementing this type of technology. You can decide to forbid certain uses, like, for instance, say, I don't know, it's just an example. For instance, no facial recognition for minors. This would be a decision. It's possible to do it, but it's assessed on a case-by-case basis. And if we need to have clear red lines, I think this is a debate we should have today, whether we should have clear red lines, what are those clear red lines, and this is a political choice.
Okay, thank you. I will now open the floor for you. Please raise your hand if you have a question. And someone with the microphone, I think, will come to you. And please mention your name and the organization you are representing, and please also state to whom the question is addressed at the podium, and I think we'll do a round of 4 and try to make it short, and then we try to do another round and answer. Okay.
Hi, my name is Shankar Narayan. I'm based in Seattle, and until January 1st was the Technology and Liberty Privacy Project Director for ACLU in Washington State. This is to those members of the panel who are arguing for safeguards around facial recognition. And one question I have is how you account for the fact that both with previous surveillance technologies and with facial recognition itself, safeguards actually have been blown through quite with great impunity often by law enforcement to use this technology in ways that are targeted against certain communities, for example, or far beyond the safeguards or even constitutional protections that were envisioned. I think, for example, the Muslim community in New York was subjected to a years-long warrantless, suspicionless surveillance program that was later declared to be unconstitutional and thrown out entirely. But of course, that didn't prevent the surveillance from happening using license plate readers, cameras, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the theoretical conversation about safeguards is great, but we have evidence now about bad police practices developing. There's a Georgetown law report about misuse of facial recognition technology itself. How can we actually guarantee, right, in the world we are, that the safeguards aren't simply going to be blown through as they have in the case of literally every previous surveillance technology? Why should face surveillance be the first one where the safeguards are actually effective?
Okay, thank you. Maybe we take another one or two.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Sid Lucas, and I represent ECR. I have a question mainly towards Lotte. It was about, you mentioned that facial recognition, artificial intelligence could enhance or even increase systemic inequalities. And my question is, how do you mean that? And also you even mentioned the racial component of this. And the same question, what do you mean by that and how are we to understand that?
Okay, thank you. And another one? Ah, yeah. It's difficult to see because it's so much light here to see the room. Okay.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. My question's mainly for Lotte. You don't need to convince me about the dangers of facial recognition. I get it. As a gay man, I'm very sensitive to the potential for abuse. But I liked your framing about spaces in which it might be appropriate. I think it's also worth asking, just as you did, spaces where it's not appropriate, spaces where it would be useful. I can imagine a lot of situations where people would actually really want to use it. Industry conferences, for example, people go to network. They'd love to be able to recognize people on the stage floor. I'd like to hear your thoughts about how to distinguish between the cases that you've cited where it would be clearly harmful from cases where it really could have a really beneficial use. Second question, let's not forget that about 2% of the population, which is more than 3 times the percentage of the population that identify as transgender, about 2% of the population are face blind. They have just as much difficulty recognizing faces as dyslexics do reading. These are people for whom facial recognition would be a life-changing, beneficial opportunity in every aspect of their lives. And I'd like to hear your thoughts and everyone else's about how to deal with that. And then lastly, I take the point that was just raised by the ACLU gentleman, but in some ways it sounds like he thinks that we can just put the genie in the bottle and keep it there. I think it's going to happen no matter what. Someone's going to do it, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about how we deal with that risk and not think that if we just stop it everywhere, that no one's face is going to be ID. Let's assume that it's going to happen, and then deal with those risks and try to make sure that it isn't used in the situations where it, as you say, really is harmful.
Okay, I think we take it from here, and maybe I think you know who was addressed and with the first question, and then we.
There's one more question here.
There's one more. Or should we do just? I think we just do here a first round, and then maybe we come to a second round because I think this was already a lot of questions, and we try to make it short, and then we try to get a second round. Okay, so I don't know who wants. Maybe
I'll
not always.
kick off.
You know.
I'll kick off. I'll answer the first question from ACLU. I won't comment on the US system, but in Europe we try to have clear laws and we have to try to have strong regulators. So I think the answer to this is on the one hand have a law that is clear on what is possible, what is not possible, and have safeguards in there that are clear for everyone, and of course have very strong regulators that have powers, that exercise their powers, and that have enough resources to be able to exercise their powers. The fact that we have independent authorities that are here to help regulate, help implement GDPR, I think is a specificity we have in the EU compared to the US, which is very important because this is what ensures that the legal framework is actually correctly implemented and that fundamental rights of people are being preserved.
Shall I take up from here?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there were several questions addressed to me, so I will pick up these ones. First, some explaining about the racial element. What you see is that at least now the technology doesn't work equally well on people of color in comparison to white people, and the same along the lines of gender. Therefore, the risks of false negatives are spread unequally over society. So you could say the technology itself is, at least at this point, because it's the question whether it's possible to develop this out of the technology, but is inherently discriminatory. And this is along the lines of the color of our skin and a gender bias, which is the same as some inequalities that are seen in societies. If you look at surveillance means, for example, they are mostly targeted, for example, in Muslim communities. It was a bit in the line with the question of the ACLU as well. And therefore, if the false positives are unequally spread in the same way as the targeting of the surveillance measures, that might enhance and exacerbate each other. So I hope this explains a bit the point. The other question was about useful cases. Well, I heard about one case of facial recognition that I found pretty useful, and this was for elderly people who suffer from dementia. And in that case, they could use facial recognition to help them recognize their family members. But I think you can develop such a technology in a way that not the same risks apply as to a use case when we're talking about surveillance context, because you can design the technology in a way that the data is safely stored, and you can do the data protection in a good way, because the people that are scanned by this technology are really limited. It's just the family members. They can consent. If they don't want to, they can find another way to figure out how to let their relatives recognize them. It is a database that can be stored locally. It doesn't scan other people, because if I go to my grandma doesn't need to scan other people. She just wants to scan me to say, hey, Lotte, nice that you're here. So I think there's definitely ways in which the technology can be a problem solver. I just don't believe in it in public space. And last point, and I think I have said enough in this round. I don't really believe in the argument it is going to happen anyway. I think we really have to think of what kind of societies we want to live in, what we think is important. I think this is also the reason why we have a human rights framework, because we decided that we have to protect some things that we think are really valuable, and I think we should stand for that. Thanks.
Complete the round.
Yeah, I think that largely it seems there is not so much difference. I certainly agree with Gwendal the way he approaches this. On just to give you one example, the Fundamental Rights Agency recently had a workshop on facial recognition technology. They did also really wonderful reports looking into some of the cases that have been decided in particular by DPAs. There is eventually one thing, that there is this differences occurring in how public interest is defined in this context. That is something we might want to look at. it's also interesting to look at, and that might be really different from the situation in the States, which I cannot comment on because I'm not an expert in this, but in Germany they did trials at stations, train stations, and because there is no legal basis, also not for trials, they used CCTV cameras that were already installed, but marked the area in which the camera was used, and then they had a watch list, and we didn't talk about watch lists in the context of surveillance, that was based on voluntary, so this was not actually a real watch list, but it was one drawn up for this specific trial, so the whole environment was artificially pulled together, and I don't know enough on the details, of course, but it seemed to me that based on the fact what we know from Spiegel and in the German news, that the efficiency in the specific cases were so overwhelming that the German police, respectively Ministry of Interior, is now drafting a law that will be adapted for the use. Now, I think that's where the debate needs to happen, in defining exactly for what type of reasons it should be or not used, and that's the societal debate we have, and this is for governments and society to decide together. So facial recognition technology generally, the correctness has increased significantly over the years, and there is often, the NIST does really good reports on this, and it's really interesting that where you see the false negatives occurring often then because they're in the lists, they look at, there's twins, for example, on kids, facial recognition doesn't work really well. I think we have work to do in Europe in understanding what type of sensitivities we have. Most of the arguments that we hear about is about the racial divide in the United States, and we have different ethnic problems in Europe, different discriminations, and we should eventually, as a society, start for Europe to think about what are our downsides, so that we can actually address these more specifically. And it's sort of more like, okay, how can we actually use that for better intent to make this a better society? And then one case that I in particular really like as a positive use case, we have in our Cambridge lab a project which includes a blind boy that uses a HoloLens equipped with facial recognition technology in certain environments, because again, you need to have a watch list against which you actually identify people. One of the reasons that our researcher has started with this pilot project is that there is medical research that a lot of blind kids are autistic or have, but this is not necessarily because they're born that way, but because they don't have the ability to in our society to integrate. And this boy that is now using that technology has, and this is what I think behind, there was someone mentioning this, is such a game changer for his life when he's now integrated in a classroom and actually can recognize the other students around him. Of course, there has been a lot of work going into this project in actually making this fit with privacy in mind for everybody who is surrounded with them. It required a lot of discussions on how to make this with the teachers and the students, but it's a really good, I think, use case.
Maybe before we pass the word around, I just have to say something to the train station example, because I'm from Germany and I'm very afraid of this idea, because in this test field in Berlin, they had you said it's very precise now, they had they had mistakes in 0.5% of the cases. Mm-hmm. If you do this in a Frankfurt train station, where there are 460,000 travelers every day, and you have 0.5% wrong or false hits, it seems to be a very small number, but these are 2,300 people per day. And if we do this over whole Germany, I think it's or even Europe, I think it's unbelievable. And I think we should not do this. But this is just a little remark from my side. So now I pass it on to you. Maybe we do a second little round with maybe very short and precise questions, and then we try to give precise answers, because I heard that we are throwing out of the room very hard if we are going over the time. So let's go to the next. Yeah.
Hi, this is Vicky Janssen of the Data Justice Lab. I just want to have a question, because like the representative of CNIL said, these are government and parliament decisions in the end, like what do we want in society. But what my problem is that especially public institutions to a certain extent can, with a lot of impunity, test and finance these sort of technologies. And I was wondering if there's any way we can hold them to account in a different way. So how do we circumvent this impunity? Because this is actually allowing a lot of surveillance technology to be tested and piloted, and I don't think we really have a good answer to this.
Okay. Is there other questions, or?
I think we take 3. There were some other questions, and then we do the last round and close it. There was a question over there.
Thank you. Jan Penfart, European Digital Rights. I have a very brief question for Cornelia Kutra. I was very interested to see Microsoft being engaged in that discussion very early on, and hearing that the company is interested in having that technology regulated. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about if you had if the company had spent a lot of thoughts into how the regulation should look like, how far should it go? Are you thinking into banning certain types of use cases, or is it more like is it more like soft law, or can you tell a little more about that? Thank you.
And maybe one last question somewhere. No, out there. There are some more hands.
Hi, my name's Ella Jakubowska, and I'm an intern at EDRI. And somewhat building on the last 2 questions, again, I'm very interested in Microsoft actively seeking out legislation. But as far as I'm aware, that doesn't preclude Microsoft and other similar companies from still taking other proactive measures. So I'm just wondering if that's a conscious kind of internal political choice not to do more, or how that really plays out. Thank you.
Okay, I think that we start with you, and then a lot of questions to Microsoft.
Okay, so the question is how we keep the upper hand on experimentations. I think there's some answers already in the legal framework. Some uses are, in principle, not possible unless, for instance, in France, you have a law or decree, and both of them go through the scrutiny of a certain number of jurisdictions in France. So I take the example of the decree. The decree is taken by the government after it has been examined by the CNIL, which is the French Data Protection Authority, and the Conseil d'État, which is the high administrative court. So that's before you actually implement a system for public security and public space. And then the scrutiny by the Data Protection Authority, because we can do inspections and we can ask for corrective measures. So you can't just decide to do an experimentation and say, it's there, and I won't be inspected, and if it's unlawful, and you can be fined, you can be asked to implement corrective measures, and for some systems, there is scrutiny by the Data Protection Authority and other organizations. If it's implemented by private organizations, the keyword will be consent. Consent means an alternative. I can decide to go in the system, or I can decide without any additional burden for me to go in through another system. So these are the main keywords that you need to keep in mind, basically, when you think about facial recognition. So at the end of the day, it boils down to control. It's political control to decide on the red line for the use cases. It's human control when The legal basis is consent. Human control means an alternative. I decide to go in it, or I decide to do something else than facial recognition. It's technical control. It's more privacy friendly when the biometric data stays with me, and I can decide to destroy it. I know who is reading it. And it's going to be regulation also, which is also part of this control, which means that before and after the system is deployed, there are some people who can scrutinize and check that you're actually in compliance with the legal framework.
Yes. So, the first I would like to say that Microsoft did participate in the deep dive of the assessment list of the high-level group on AI, which sort of is a first step to implement an AI governance process in companies that either develop or deploy artificial intelligence. We didn't do this specifically on facial recognition. In the context with our Office of Responsible AI and researchers that participated, my first question was at the time, obviously, like, why don't we use facial recognition technology? And they were, that's a more easy thing. We used a different AI to do this, where questions become much more complex. I'm just saying that because some of the issues that we're discussing are probably also valid for broader AI discussions. So what are we asking for? I start with the other question of what we are ourselves doing. So after our ethical principles that we have published and we are implementing now into AI governance processes, we've also published specific AI principles for facial recognition that, for example, include how we contract with our customers, that those who deploy the facial recognition technology, for example, that they do not engage in unlawful discrimination, and that we will advocate for safeguards for people to people's democratic freedom in law enforcement surveillance scenarios, which is why I'm here today. And there is a real problem in the conversation if we only look at GDPR and data protection requirements. But as Gwenda said, there will be other laws that will, in the specific cases where it is currently not legal, that will provide the legal basis for doing it. I think there is a real important question for those who deploy it in all legal cases, and as Gwenda said, there is many legal cases that the deployers of the technology have the ability to actually understand whether the technology is fit for the specific use case, and everything with AI is very specific to specific case scenarios. So that's why we think that there is, independent from GDPR, room for regulating the developers of the facial recognition technologies are, if they want to market their technology within Europe, that they need to make their technology available for third-party testing, and that they need to document the capabilities of the technology. We've called parts of that data sheets for data sets. And you can sort of think more in terms of what we know in terms of medicine. We have documentation that comes along, or in the context of electronic components, where every device has extensive data documentation lists. And these, I think, overall, this is the way we have to go in order to make developers, but also deployers, long-term accountable for what they deliver to the market.
Okay, there was no question to you, right? So then I'll go further on and maybe give you a chance, or our panelists a chance for our last closing remarks after this interesting discussion. And maybe we start with you, because now you had it in the first round, you had a lot of questions, now you did not have a question, so we make it fair in the end.
Something to add. One thought I had during your story about the threshold of probability and a false acceptance and rejection rates was that this is a point where we already see that technology is impacting our debate. We're thinking about numbers. Facial recognition works in the way that there is a database that is ordered on the kind of amount of probability of a match. And then somebody should decide at a probability of X, we classify it high enough to be a match. And it is quite weird that we're talking about an acceptability rate there, but we're talking about people and how many false positives we find acceptable in relation to the risk of a false negative, which translates to how many people on the streets are stopped without having a good basis for that. How many of them do we think is acceptable to counter the risk of not recognizing one person we might be looking for? Yes. So I think that is a really funny way of having the discussion, and the technology is there deciding the framework for it. I think we should not do that. I think we should decide the framework for it.
I'll try to summarize the takeaway. For me is, first of all, keep in mind there's different cases, there's different use cases. Not all applications of facial recognition are born equal, I would say, in terms of risks. There's different risks. Some of them are inherent to the technology. The fact that you can measure a face at a distance without people being aware of it is very important. The potential for mass surveillance is also something that needs to be taken into account, of course. There is a legal framework that has been recently modernized that has recognized that biometric data are sensitive data. We need to remember this when we discuss about facial recognition. We need to remember this when we talk about trials, about experiments. And finally, we have DPAs, and DPAs will play their role both in advising those that are that want to deploy this type of system to make sure that they comply with the law, and they will inspect and ask for corrective measures if necessary. So this is the takeaway, I think.
And we have to make sure that these DPAs in every member state have the means to do that. It's also something we really clearly have to look about. Okay, your closing remark.
I think this is a really important debate. Eventually, what was missing is having someone from law enforcement here, just to have a few, because this is where these limitations or entire prohibitions happen is a public debate that requires all these stakeholders, but the broader stakeholder engagement is certainly important. We are calling for these safeguards to be in place in all countries, and here in Europe, I think we have a huge advantage because there is such a good foundation already. Yeah, that's it. I'm glad I'm here, and this is to be continued.
Okay. So I would like to thank our three speakers for their time and their interesting contributions to this, I think, interesting debate, and it will stay with us in the next month. The Commission will release their white paper on artificial intelligence and also on facial recognition in, I think, end of February. So we're really looking forward to see this debate going on, and I would also like to thank you all for attending this session, and hopefully see you soon or at the next privacy platform, and thanks a lot.